Hey guys, today we're going to ease into the foggy candlelit alleys of the medieval world. Not the sword-swinging, dragon-slaying parts you might expect, but a quieter, stranger path. One where women tiptoe across creaking floors, stuffing cold cabbage leaves into their shoes. Where avoiding pregnancy wasn't just a matter of timing, it was a full-body ritual guided by moonlight mystery and occasionally a dash of desperation. You're going to drift through a time when birth control wasn't something you picked up at the pharmacy, but something you prayed for, bargained over, or secretly brewed with backyard herbs. Tonight we're focusing on the quiet, peculiar, and often absurd ways medieval women tried to avoid childbirth, because in a world where every pregnancy could be dangerous, sometimes the weirdest solutions were also the most hopeful. And let's be honest, you probably wouldn't survive medieval childbirth, most people didn't. So yeah, this was serious business. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is, I'm always curious. Now let's dim the torches, step carefully over the damp straw and get very, very sleepy. You're in a stone cottage that smells faintly of boiled turnips and wet wool. A fire crackles low in the hearth. Your feet are sore from the market road, but you sit down on a rough stool and reach under your dress to pull off your shoes, only to find them stuffed with slightly wilted cabbage leaves. Yes, this is on purpose. It wasn't uncommon in certain pockets of medieval Europe for women to believe that cabbages, especially when cold, carried protective properties. It wasn't always about preventing pregnancy directly. It was more about cooling the body, drawing away excess heat, which was often associated with fertility. In the strange medical theories of the time, thanks Hippocrates, a woman's womb was ruled by temperature, moisture, and other oddly poetic forces. So putting cabbage leaves in your shoes, not as bonkers as it sounds. It was thought to absorb unwanted energies, lower the humours, and help regulate menstruation. Plus it was cabbage. Everywhere. Cheap, available, vaguely magical. Some even believe that walking with these leafy insoles during certain moon phases could align the body with natural infertility. Not scientifically supported, obviously, but neither was most medieval medicine. Historians still argue whether this was based on folk knowledge passed through generations or whether it was just another one of those ideas that sort of stuck because nobody had a better plan. You imagine the scene, a tired woman in a long linen smock smoothing out the wrinkled green leaves, sliding them into place. Maybe whispering a few words for luck, maybe not. Then heading out to milk the goats, hoping the cabbage keeps her from having to feed another mouth 9 months from now. Meanwhile, a neighbour down the lane might be doing something different. Maybe drinking a tea made from moss. Maybe chanting, maybe just praying she's already infertile thanks to her age or recent illness. The cabbage trick may sound mild, but it fits into a broader medieval idea that you could nudge your body away from conception if you were clever, quiet, and committed. A woman's body was seen as a delicate, moody machine, susceptible to changes in temperature, stress, weather, and especially food, and cabbage was a particularly layered vegetable, pun intended. Beyond shoes, women also use cabbage in poultices as topical applications for womb cooling, or even tucked under their pillows to ward off lust. Yes, really. A cabbage leaf under your pillow was a medieval turn-off button, move over cold showers. And if you're wondering, did any of this actually work? No. Not even a little bit. But try telling that to someone who's never even heard of an ovum, or a sperm cell, or for that matter bacteria. Medicine at the time followed the humorism theory 4 fluids ruled your health: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Imbalances caused everything. Excess heat could make your womb overactive. So cool it, literally. It's also possible cabbage leaves just felt comforting, like how people now put cucumber slices on their eyes, knowing full well it won't fix their mortgage, but hey, it feels nice. One fringe belief even held that if you placed cabbage near your door, it would repel not only evil spirits but also unwanted pregnancies. The logic was patchy, but the hope was real, and so women tried quietly. They couldn't really talk about these things openly, not with the church breathing down their necks. But behind closed doors, in fields over spinning wheels, they shared tips, tricks, and yes, even cabbage secrets. Was it strange? Yes. Was it effective? No. Was it better than doing nothing, maybe in a deeply psychological way? One overlooked aspect is how these rituals, cabbage leaves, foot baths, whispered words, gave women some sense of control. When childbirth could kill you, when your own fertility was a mystery, even to physicians doing something, anything, felt powerful. You tuck your feet back under your skirts, cabbage slipping slightly in your worn shoes. There's a smell of earth and vinegar in the air like something pickled. A breeze moves through the shutters. Somewhere a rooster coughs, or snores. It's hard to tell. No one really writes cabbage poetry anymore. But once a woman bent over in a candlelit kitchen whispering over a boiling pot might have sworn by its powers. The leaves may have wilted, but the belief endured. You're still sitting on that rough little stool now, barefoot, the cabbage leaves cooling beneath your toes. But tonight the kitchen has a sharper scent. Tangy. Acidic. There's a bowl on the table, half filled with lemon rinds and something that looks suspiciously like ash. You're about to learn that in medieval times, cleanliness wasn't just about scrubbing floors or washing hands. It was also about attempting to cleanse the womb. You dip your fingers into the bowl, curious, and wince. The mix stings a little. Not surprising. You've just met one of the medieval world's more ambitious contraceptive concoctions, lemons and lye. Or something close to it. In cities like Venice or London, behind shuttered bathhouses and smoky kitchens, women experimented with citrus and alkaline substances as a form of internal barrier. If you cringed just now, that's reasonable. This wasn't exactly gentle skincare. It was part desperation, part creativity, and part trial and error passed down through whispers, not textbooks. One popular technique, hollowing out a lemon half and inserting it into the body, that body part as a makeshift cervical cap. The citric acid was thought to kill or block what people would later understand as sperm, though they didn't have that word yet. They just knew something went in and something came out 9 months later unless you did something to intervene. Historians still argue whether this was a widespread practice or just a fringe idea mentioned in a few questionable medical texts. But even fringe ideas have a way of sticking around when options are limited. The lye part. That's a little trickier and definitely riskier. Lye was used in soaps and cleaning products even in ancient times. It's caustic, burns your skin, and yet some women reportedly diluted it and used it in douching mixtures, believing it would purify the womb. That's one way to describe it. Another way, very bad idea. Still, these solutions didn't come from nowhere. Medieval medicine believed the womb could be clean or dirty, open or sealed, and that acids and alkalis could alter its state. If pregnancy was an unwanted outcome, then maybe an acidic or caustic environment would prevent it. Maybe. Modern medicine, of course, would not recommend any of this. But you're not in a modern world. You're in a smoky, low-ceilinged cottage where lemons are expensive and knowledge is rarer than soap. You can imagine a woman carefully slicing a lemon, scooping it out, applying a little ash, or even wine vinegar, and inserting it before a visit to her husband's bed. Quietly. No one needed to know. No one could know. Some women might have passed down these recipes the way others passed down bread-making tips or sewing tricks. Maybe there was a little leather-bound book hidden in a floorboard. Maybe a grandmother whispered it to her granddaughter during laundry day. Maybe it was shared under the clatter of rain on the thatched roof, with one eye on the doorway and the other on the lemon bowl. Lemons, of course, weren't grown everywhere. In colder northern climates, women used sour apples vinegar or even diluted wine. The idea was always the same: acidic equals anti-fertile. Whether it did anything or just burned terribly is anyone's guess. One particularly odd fringe recipe from the 13th century even suggests mixing lemon juice with crushed pearls. No idea where someone working in a medieval bakery was getting pearls, but hey, dream big. The result was believed to be a rich woman's solution to child spacing. Whether it worked or just glittered going in, we'll never know. You glance again at the bowl. It's steaming slightly now, the ash fizzing as the lemon oil reacts. The smell is oddly nostalgic, sharp clean with the ghost of desperation. And behind these strange brews was always the same goal control. A woman's body was so often dictated by her role as wife, mother, servant, breeder. The risks of childbirth were so immense, the toll on the body so severe, that even something as ridiculous as inserting lemon ash up your skirt was preferable to rolling the reproductive dice. There were no doctors who specialised in women's reproductive health, at least not officially. So women took matters into their own hands, often literally. Some women used mixtures like this after intimacy in hopes of flushing out whatever might lead to pregnancy. Others used them before trying to build a hostile environment. Again, hostile is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. Of course there were consequences. Pain, infections, internal damage. But there weren't many options. Abstinence wasn't always possible. Marriage didn't mean choice. And the church, as you'll see later, wasn't exactly handing out free passes for herbal contraception. Still, despite all this, some of the ideas almost hinted at real science. Acidity can affect sperm motility. Barriers do reduce risk. Timing does matter. It's just that no one had microscopes or germ theory, or the ability to test their theories without well trial runs. And if the concoctions didn't work, There were always prayers. Women lit candles to obscure saints, prayed to female martyrs, and whispered invocations in the quiet hours after midnight. But many still turned to their kitchens because vinegar was cheaper than miracles. The bowl is empty now. You pour it out the back door, watching it steam against the dirt. In the distance, a dog barks. A goat sneezes. You're not sure if any of this would keep you from getting pregnant, but you do know it made you feel like you had a say, which back then was no small thing. You're on the move now, strolling slowly down a forest path dappled in early moonlight, your cloak pulled tight around your shoulders. There's a rustle in your satchel, a small pouch warm from your body heat, holding what may or may not be the crushed toe of a frog, or a scrap of wool soaked in something questionable. You try not to think about it. Tonight, it's not about herbal brews or acidic fruit slices. Tonight, it's about the quiet power of amulets and the belief that if you wore the right object close enough to your skin, especially near your armpit, it could keep pregnancy at bay. It sounds absurd now, of course, but in the medieval imagination, the line between the physical and the magical was blurrier than a fogged-up window. You didn't need to understand how your body worked. You just needed to understand what to carry and where to hide it. You slip your hand under your tunic and feel it your amulet. Rough knotted twine wrapped around something leathery and brittle. You don't even want to know what's inside. You were told to wear it for 6 nights, remove it on the 7th, then bury it beneath a tree, then start over if necessary. It's that kind of routine, like medieval skincare but worse. One widespread belief was that wearing a particular amulet under your left armpit could repel conception. The left side of the body was considered more connected to female energy, more porous, more susceptible, more womb adjacent. That's not a real anatomical term, but then again, neither were most things in 1300. Some amulets were made of metal bronze discs inscribed with Latin prayers or planetary symbols. Others were more organic dried toad skins, bits of rabbit bone, pieces of coral, or even small stones that had been touched by lightning. You know, very casual items. Historians still argue whether these amulets were symbolic, medicinal, magical, or all three. There's evidence from 14th century apothecary lists that these items were traded, bought and worn by women of all classes. A noblewoman might wear a polished amber bead wrapped in silk, while a farm wife might carry a knuckle bone in a scrap of cloth. Different styles, same wish: avoid pregnancy, please and thank you. The strangest part. These weren't always hidden. Sometimes women wore their charms openly, necklaces, belts, even hairpins carved with protective runes. But when it came to fertility, the charm was usually tucked under the arm, close to the heart, under layers of linen and wool. It had to be warm. It had to be private. A popular fringe belief among midwives claimed that if a woman carried a mole's foot, or more unsettlingly, the foot of a stillborn animal stitched into a pouch and worn under the arm during her monthly cycle, she would remain infertile. Was it true? Of course not. Was it gross? Absolutely. But the hope behind it was real, and some amulets came with spoken components. A charm might only activate if the woman recited a certain rhyme each morning, usually in Latin, sometimes in a local dialect, sometimes in a mix of both that nobody fully understood. But hey, it was tradition. You murmur one now, just for practice. Something about the moon, a saint and a locked gate. It feels silly, but also oddly comforting, like repeating a bedtime mantra. There's a legend from southern France about a woman who wore a silver coin in her shoe wrapped in red thread and soaked in her own spit. Every time she walked, the coin clinked softly, and she believed it knocked conception out of her path. Did it work? No clue. But she had 8 children fewer than her neighbours, so you can imagine the rumours. In northern Italy, meanwhile, young women were said to steal feathers from nesting birds and twist them into tiny knots, with their own hair, wearing the result as a talisman to ward off seed. Again, deeply unsettling visual, but in a world where pregnancy meant a gamble with death, who could blame them? Some scholars think amulets served another purpose entirely, a psychological one. When you have no real power, making a charm gives you power. You believe it works, and so your body responds. Maybe you avoid intimacy on risky days. Maybe you drink less wine. Maybe you pray harder. Maybe it's all behaviour reinforcement in a linen pouch. Of course, the church disapproved. Openly. Vehemently. Any charm not blessed by a priest was considered witchcraft or heresy, and anything involving animal parts definitely suspicious. But enforcement was uneven. A priest might scold you one week, then look the other way the next, especially if his sister was wearing the same toadfoot under her tunic. There's even record of clerics confiscating amulets from midwives only to sell them later at market. Everyone had a hustle. Some women, especially in rural areas, went even further. They combined their amulets with rituals spinning counterclockwise while reciting a charm burying herbs on certain moon phases, avoiding mirrors during menstruation. It was part folklore, part chaos, part comfort blanket with bones in it. And of course there were fakes. Marketplace tricksters selling infertility stones that were just river pebbles dipped in oil. Or blessed belts that were never near a church. But women still bought them. Not because they were gullible, but because they were desperate. You adjust your own amulet under your sleeve. It's itchy, a little sticky, but oddly reassuring, like carrying a secret that might protect you from something terrible, or at least give you hope. And in a world where medical advice included things like drink nettle juice and pray harder, a rabbit's foot in your armpit didn't seem all that strange. You pass a tree and think about burying your charm, but not yet. You still have 4 nights left, and a few more miles to walk. The night deepens as you step off the forest path, your boots crunching into gravel outside a small wooden cottage lit by a single flickering window. Inside, you hear the rhythmic creak of a rocking chair and the soft clink of metal on wood. You push open the crooked door and step into a room filled with herbal smoke and the smell of beeswax candles. A midwife sits hunched over a worn table, chalking tiny circles and crescents onto a slate board. Her lips move soundlessly and her eyes flick to the sky beyond the shutters. She's counting, not money, not sheep, but moon cycles and your body's mysteries. Welcome to the world of lunar fertility math medieval style. You take a seat across from her, already knowing she'll ask when your last bleeding happened. She won't say period, that word doesn't exist yet, at least not how you know it. She'll ask when your moon visited, or when the red veil fell, or some equally poetic euphemism, and you'll answer hoping she can work out your odds. Because tonight you're here to talk about the calendar. Not the Gregorian one, obviously. You're in a time when women tried to map the rhythms of their bodies using the stars, the moon, and the muttered wisdom of those who came before. This was medieval fertility awareness, but without the charts and thermometers. Just guesswork, chalk dust, and quiet hope. It starts with the idea that a woman is fertile during a certain window of her cycle. Logical enough. But without understanding ovulation or hormonal shifts, the method leaned heavily on symbolism. The full moon. Dangerous. New moon. Maybe safer. A waning moon. Supposedly a time when the womb was closing. Historians still argue whether these moon-based methods were practiced widely, or if they were more localized folk beliefs shared between midwives and apprentices. But records show that midwives often used a wheel of days, a simple wooden disc or linen cloth marked with 28 points, sometimes stitched with beads or stones rotated daily to track time. Of course, nobody understood the precise biological mechanics. They just knew patterns, rough ones, passed down from mothers and aunties who noticed things, like how certain days seemed more likely to bring on conception, or how sex during a stormy night might lead to twins. That's not science, but it definitely made for nervous husbands. The midwife across from you now traces her finger over a piece of parchment filled with notes, some in Latin, some in a local dialect, some just scratched symbols. Only she seems to understand. She's not just doing math, she's divining. She asks how many days your flow lasted, if you felt feverish, if your dreams were strange. Because in this time, dreams were data. A red bird meant fertility, a fish swimming upstream pregnancy, a broken wheel, safe days. Probably. Maybe. Don't bet your life on it, but also, definitely don't ignore it. One fringe belief held that if you conceived under a waxing moon, your child would be strong but reckless. A waning moon, wise but frail. And if the moon was hidden behind clouds, it meant the soul of the baby had yet to choose its body. You couldn't plan a family, but you could try to plan around the cosmos. The church, interestingly, wasn't entirely opposed to this method. After all, it didn't involve herbs or charms or any pagan-seeming brews, just counting and restraint. In fact, some clergy even encouraged couples to avoid marital congress during a woman's fertile period, not to prevent pregnancy, but because it was considered unclean. Nice. You lean back and watch the midwife adjust a string of beads on her womb wheel. Each bead marks a day. She's moved one twice now, mumbling under her breath. You want to ask if she's sure, but she's never sure. Nobody is. That's the point. There's a long tradition of fertility calculation methods across cultures. Even in medieval Europe, Jewish, Muslim and Christian women shared surprisingly similar ideas, cycles of 28 to 30 days midpoint danger zones, and post-bleeding safe windows. Sometimes these methods overlapped with religious purity laws. Sometimes they were private practical rituals tucked behind closed doors, and passed from woman to woman like heirloom cloth. One woman might mark her fertile days with red thread tied around her wrist. Another might set aside a white headscarf for days when she believed it was safe. And some just counted stones, one per day, tucked into a pouch, slowly transferred from one side of the fireplace to the other. You glance around the room. On a shelf is a bowl filled with polished pebbles, some pale, some painted red. They're smooth from use. Little tokens of time quietly carried by women hoping to avoid the dangerous blessing of another child. The fringe side of this practice involved more elaborate divination. A midwife might burn a twig of rosemary and read the smoke or drop wax into water and interpret the shape. Others claimed to read a woman's pulse to detect her open state. That's not a thing, but back then it sounded authoritative enough. And there were rules. Sleep with your head facing west on safe nights. Never eat leeks during your danger week. Don't look at the moon directly if your womb feels heavy. All very official sounding and all very unproven. Yet despite the wild inconsistencies, some women managed to space their children. Coincidence? Possibly. Caution? Almost certainly. Because even if the math was murky, the effort was real. You avoided intimacy on days when the midwife looked nervous. You added a day or two to be safe, and when in doubt you faked a headache. That's one medieval tradition still going strong. You thank the midwife tucking the little cloth wheel she's given you into your satchel. It's crude, just a circle of stitched hemp with dyed beans sewn into it. But it's yours now. A quiet way to try to outsmart biology, in a time when biology had all the upper hand. You step back into the night, the moon veiled behind a thin sheet of cloud. Somewhere a dog howls, a bat flutters past, and you walk on counting days in your head, knowing they might be wrong, but still feeling better for trying. The road curves, and with it the air grows tangier sharp, with the scent of something sour left too long in the sun. You follow your nose, passing a garden patch where the vines droop low and the soil is cracked with age. There, next to a warped fence and a crumbling stone bench, you find a woman crouched over a wooden bucket, grinding herbs into a briny puddle. She doesn't look up, just gestures toward the vinegar jug beside her. You've arrived at the vinegar womb defense. In the world you're walking through, vinegar isn't just for preserving pickles or soaking turnip peels. It's a key ingredient in one of the more common and slightly more logical attempts at birth control. Not effective, mind you, just common, and maybe a little less terrifying than toad bones or goat bladder sheaths. The woman mutters something about wormwood and dips a rough cloth into the mixture, wringing it out until the pale linen turns almost translucent. She's making what some referred to as a pessary, a homemade vaginal insert soaked in vinegar, and herbs meant to either kill sperm, though no one called them that yet, or block their path altogether. You sit on a sun-warmed stone watching the preparation with a mixture of curiosity and low-key horror. She's been at this for years. Midwives in nearby villages send women her way when they want to avoid adding yet another child to their already overworked hearth. The logic goes like this: vinegar is sharp, sour cleansing. It was used in everything from cleaning wounds to flavouring food. So why not apply it to the reproductive system? After all, it kills worms, right? Maybe it kills other unwanted things too. Of course, medieval understanding of anatomy was spotty at best. The uterus was still sometimes described as a wandering creature, literally called the hysterica passio in Latin, believed to float around the body causing problems. So the idea of bathing it in vinegar seemed just sensible enough to try. Some women used vinegar-soaked cloths as barriers, tucking them inside like early uncomfortable tampons. Others combined it with herbs like rue pennyroyal, or tansy plants known or at least rumoured to affect fertility. One recipe from a 14th century Italian herbal manual suggested boiling rosemary in vinegar until the liquid turned gold, then inserting a sponge soaked in it after intercourse. Historians still argue whether these methods were genuinely meant as contraceptives, or more like post-coital cleansing rituals. But when you squint at the evidence, a picture emerges: women were actively experimenting. And vinegar, for all its acidity, felt cleaner than most alternatives. Smelled better too. Tonight's potion, for example, includes vinegar, mint crushed bark, and what might be ground oyster shell. Don't ask. It's better not to know. There's also a belief fringe, but repeated in enough scattered texts, that vinegar sealed the womb. Not physically, of course, but spiritually or elementally. The sourness combined with the cooling nature of certain herbs was believed to temporarily close the body's inner door to life. In a way, you're not just applying a fluid, you're casting a kind of temporary spell. And here's where things get mildly comedic if slightly tragic. A 15th century physician named Trotula, yes, she was real, and unusually pro-women's health for the time, warned against excessive use of vinegar pessaries, claiming they could cause unsettledness of the womb and collapse of the inner tissues. which sounds bad, really bad. But she also admitted that for some they provided rest from the burden of bearing. You look at the woman beside you now carefully folding the soaked cloth into a small cone. She wraps it in thin muslin and places it inside a lidded jar lined with beeswax. She makes enough for 3, one for herself, one for her neighbour, and one for a local baker's wife who keeps having twins. You ask how long it's supposed to stay in. She shrugs. Until the vinegar stops stinging, she mutters, "Some versions of this method used a sponge, real sea sponge, tied to a ribbon or horsehair string for retrieval. So yes, medieval tampon technology wasn't that far off, though it came without the helpful pamphlet or a hotline number. Church officials weren't particularly fond of any of this naturally, but vinegar was common, and its use didn't seem overtly magical or rebellious, so it often flew under the radar, especially when done privately, without bells chants or questionable Latin. Still word spread, quietly, through markets at wells whispered during bread kneading. Try vinegar, they'd say. It's sharp, it stings a little, but it might help. And even when it didn't, women kept doing it. Because what else was there? No pills, no latex, no informed consent in many cases. Just your own cleverness, a jug of vinegar and a prayer that your room stayed closed. One fringe tidbit, there's a record from southern Spain about women using wine vinegar mixed with crushed nettles and applying it before intimacy as a sort of curse. If the man didn't finish the act, the woman believed the vinegar had spiritually blocked him. Historians are still scratching their heads over that one. Back in the garden, the woman wipes her hands on her apron. She's finished preparing the day's batch. You can tell she doesn't fully trust it to work, but it's something. And in the medieval world, something is better than nothing. You rise, stretching your legs, and the sour smell clings to your clothes. It's oddly comforting now, like the tang of pickles before dinner, or the bite of cider on a cold day. Except, this is protection, not refreshment. And as the sun dips behind the trees and you continue down the road, you can't help but feel a quiet admiration for every woman who ever stood over a vinegar pot, hoping, really hoping, that her body would listen. The sky above you is heavy now, streaked with ash-grey clouds and the faintest trail of chimney smoke in the distance. Your feet are tired, but there's a flicker of torchlight up ahead, and the faint sound of fabric being beaten against wood. Laundry night. You follow the sound until you reach the back of a manor house where 2 women are hunched over a wooden tub, elbows deep in steaming water and linen soaked with rosemary. They're not just washing sheets, they're washing away bad luck and possibly male influence. You settle nearby, pretending to fix your cloak while listening in. Because what these women are whispering about tonight is a surprisingly popular, if dubiously effective medieval theory, cleansing rituals meant to flush out male seed. Yes, you've arrived at the ancient world of postcoital rinses, or more bluntly, the medieval version of a DIY douche. In this pre-modern universe, reproductive knowledge was a guessing game, and much of it was informed by Galenic medicine and religious guilt. The belief that conception could be prevented after the act wasn't just hopeful, it was foundational. And if you were quick enough, thorough enough, and blessed by the right saint, you might just dodge the consequences. You watch as one of the women takes a ladle of rosemary-infused water and slowly pours it over a folded cloth. She mutters something about timing the sooner the better, and leans over the tub again. This isn't about hygiene, at least not in the modern sense. It's about undoing. The most common flushing agents were water, vinegar, wine, salt, brine, or herbal infusions. Rosemary was a favourite believed to be purifying and slightly drying. Others used sage, thyme, or even lavender, not for the scent, but for the belief that these herbs could dry out or neutralise male seed. Historians still argue whether these rinses were believed to physically wash out semen, or whether they were thought to cleanse the womb in some mystical or humoral way. Either way, they were common enough to be referenced in both medical and ecclesiastical writings, usually as something sinful, suspicious, or just plain female nonsense. But the logic, flawed though it may have been, makes a certain intuitive sense. If something goes in and causes pregnancy, then maybe flushing it out fast enough will stop it. What they didn't know was that sperm move quickly, very quickly, and vinegar or no, most rinses were far too late. But try explaining that to someone who still thinks the uterus has moods. One fringe tidbit from a 13th century German herbal describes a womb rinse made from wine boiled with crushed ants and powdered coral. Yes, ants. Maybe they symbolised industriousness, or maybe someone had a little too much time in the garden. But back to the rinsing. The timing was crucial. Most midwives who supported this method insisted the flush had to happen. Within the hour, some said half an hour. Others insisted you squat while doing it. Still others recommended sitting in a cold stream. No thank you. You hear the women beside you joking softly about how many times they've had to wash the moon away, a reference to the cycle they hope doesn't begin in 9 months. Their laughter is low-tired but not bitter. They know it's probably wishful thinking, but they do it anyway. It's also important to know that many of these rinses weren't solo rituals. Women helped each other. A neighbour might bring herbs, a sister might stand watch, a midwife might instruct the process in detail while reminding everyone to pray afterwards, just in case the spiritual side needed a nudge. In more urban areas, wealthier women sometimes employed personal attendants to assist in such post-coital care. One Roman-era text that lingered into medieval medical law even suggested that having a servant bounce the hips briskly after intercourse could dislodge seed. That's not a real thing, but it does paint a strange mental image. And let's not forget the church. Post-coital rinsing was seen as deeply problematic. Not only was it interfering with the divine order of procreation, but it was also viewed as female independence, intentional, informed choice. That was dangerous. Still, enforcement was spotty. Confessionals were full of women crying over unwanted pregnancies, and priests rarely asked too many questions if they sensed someone was just trying to survive. You glance toward the tub again. One woman is now adding a bundle of marjoram to the water, whispering a small chant, not quite a prayer, but not fully pagan either. She's hedging her bets. That's what most of this is really. The medieval female version of damage control. And it's not always about avoiding children entirely. Sometimes it's about spacing them, giving the body time to recover, letting one child reach their 2nd year before another is born. In a time when every birth carried real risk, this wasn't indulgence, it was survival strategy. There's a darker side too. Some rinses may have been potent enough to irritate the uterus, possibly triggering early miscarriage if used frequently or aggressively. We'll never know how often that was the intent, but the overlap between postcoital cleanses and early abortifacients was definitely a grey murky space. And sometimes the effectiveness of a rinse was judged not by the absence of pregnancy, but by the intensity of the sensation. If it stings, said one midwife's notebook, then the seed is dead. Ouch! One fringe group in southern England even had a superstition that the rinse should be discarded facing west toward the setting sun, or else it might return to the womb. Sounds absurd now, but in a worldview built on metaphor and mystery, it felt perfectly logical. The water in the tub steams gently, and the rosemary scent rises like incense. It's quiet now, just the slap of damp linen and the soft bubbling of herbs steeping. One woman reaches for a small tin of honey salve because, of course, the vinegar stings and rubs a little on her hands. There's no rush, no urgency, just this an act of slow resistance, one rinse at a time, a quiet attempt to unmake what's been done. As you stand, the women nod at you as if to say we've all been there, and maybe next month they'll be here again. Maybe you will too. You keep walking boots soft against the damp road until the path narrows into a foot trail that winds toward a cluster of low-roofed cottages, smoke curling from each chimney like secret thoughts. You've entered the edge of a village, one of those places where everyone knows everyone else's business unless it involves birth control. Then suddenly, no one knows anything at all. You're headed toward a very specific doorway. Behind it lives a woman known not as a healer, or even a midwife, but something stranger, a wise widow. Not quite a witch, not quite a doctor, but somewhere in the murky in-between. And tonight she's boiling anti-fertility stews. These aren't meals. They're consumable deterrence concoctions made to subtly shift the body's balance and discourage conception. Usually bitter, often nauseating, sometimes questionably effective. You knock once. She opens slowly, eyes sharp, mouth thin hair pulled back in a braid that's seen at least 4 decades of side-eye from the church. She lets you in wordlessly and gestures to the pot bubbling on the hearth. You know better than to ask what's in it, but she tells you anyway, because she knows you're listening for more than just curiosity. She lists ingredients like a lullaby, wild carrot seed, pennyroyal, rue mugwort, and something that looks suspiciously like blackberry root. It smells like mouldy apples and boiled socks. This, she says, is a drink for the off weeks, the liminal days between one cycle and the next, when a woman fears the worst but still hopes the bleeding will come. It's taken warm twice a day with a slice of rye bread to help the bitterness go down. Think of it as a medieval plan B, except it might just give you cramps and a funny rash. One mainstream historical fact, wild carrot seed, also known as Queen Anne's lace, really was used in many cultures as a fertility inhibitor. Ancient Greek texts mention it, and medieval herbals carried on the idea. Taken daily for several days post-intercourse, it was believed to disrupt implantation. Whether that actually worked or not remains contested, but it earned enough reputation to stay in rotation for centuries. Historians still argue whether these herbs had actual pharmacological effects, or if their use was more psychological, a woman taking control of her body with the tools she could grasp. But either way, these stews were serious business. You didn't just drink them casually. You timed them. You whispered their names. You swore secrecy. And you never let the priest smell your breath. Some versions were steeped in wine. Others boiled down into thick, almost syrupy doses, more potion than tea. A particularly nasty version included boiled sheep's dung filtered through linen, then sweetened with honey. Yes, sheep's dung. If you're not gagging a little, you're stronger than most. The wise widow hands you a mug. It's warm. Smells like hay and regret. You take a sip, it burns. Not from alcohol, but from the raw bitterness of the herbs. Your tongue curls in self-defense. She nods approvingly. If it's awful, she says it's working. Not all of these stews were drunk alone. Some were served at women's gatherings, quiet, candlelit circles where young brides sat among grandmothers, passing around steaming cups and hushed warnings. They'd talk about timing, bleeding. Husbands who didn't understand the word no. It was support group meets potion class. Sometimes the herbs weren't just drunk. They were steamed and inhaled or mixed into food or used in sitz baths. A particularly stubborn recipe involves soaking your feet in mugwort tea while drinking rue-infused cider. Nothing says contraception like bitter cider and hot toes. The real twist. Some women lied about the stews. They claimed they were tonics for digestion or headache waters. One clever baker's wife brewed her anti-fertility potion with ginger and cloves, just so the scent masked the real ingredients. So while her neighbours thought she was constantly curing indigestion, she was actually spacing her children 4 years apart. Fringe practices sometimes took this even further. There are scattered accounts of women mixing anti-fertility stews with elements from their own bodies, menstrual blood nail clippings, even hair to tie the womb against conception. These were hidden inside cakes or dissolved in honey, and then, well, let's just say dinner got very awkward. Church authorities unsurprisingly condemned this kind of thing. Strongly. But the line between medicine and magic was so blurry that enforcement became difficult. If you were caught brewing, it was one thing. If you were just sipping something brown and bitter, who could say what it was? And there were risks. Pennyroyal in particular could be dangerous, even fatal in high doses. But many women didn't know the difference between effective and toxic. They just knew what the widow down the lane said worked for her. You sit quietly by the hearth mug, warm in your hand, watching the steam curl like smoke signals to every woman who ever wished for just a little more control over her own body. The wise widow stands, stretches her back, and goes to fetch another bundle of herbs from her cupboard. You glimpse a few dried mushrooms hanging from the rafters, next to a garland of dried orange peels, and something unidentifiable wrapped in waxed cloth. This is a kitchen, yes, but it's also a battleground. Not of swords and shields, but of spoons and spoils simmering against the tide of fate. You sip again. It's no easier, but it tastes a little like power. The stew still clings to your tongue as you step out of the widow's house, the taste somewhere between bitter earth and old mint. Your stomach protests, but you're walking now, and the evening air cools the burn. Past the last cottage, the path slopes toward a field dotted with grazing sheep and a squat stone chapel just visible on the hill. The bell above it hangs still, but you've not come to pray. You're here to visit a relic belt. Yes, tonight's curiosity is about holy girdles, sacred waist belts blessed by saints, kissed by clergy, and sometimes worn under your dress to keep the babies away. You're skeptical already, but welcome to medieval Europe, where piety and practicality often share the same bed. At the edge of the chapel you find a wooden chest secured by a tarnished latch. The caretaker, an elderly man with hands like twigs and breath like boiled cabbage, unlocks it and reverently lifts a faded strip of cloth. Frayed, stained in places, but still intact. This is the girdle of St. Margaret, or so the villagers say. St. Margaret was the patron saint of childbirth and pregnancy, though her own origin story involved being swallowed by a dragon and escaping from its belly intact. Symbolism aside, she became the figure medieval women called on when facing or avoiding childbirth, and so belts and girdles in her honour became relics treasured and borrowed like sacred loaners. Women would tie these holy girdles around their waists sometimes during labour, sometimes just before intimacy, and occasionally all month long. It was thought that wearing such a relic could either protect against miscarriage or prevent pregnancy altogether depending on your faith and timing. You weren't exactly supposed to use them for contraception, but let's just say that wasn't printed on the label. Historians still argue whether these girdles were intended for magical use, protective symbolism, or moral reassurance. Some were made of silk or linen, others leather or parchment, and some had inscriptions, Latin verses, prayers, even crude depictions of the Virgin Mary or various saints worn close to the skin like spiritual armour. The fringe side of this practice involved copying the shape and markings of known relics to make your own DIY girdle at home. There are records of women sewing their names into these belts, along with stitched dates of their menstrual cycles or childbirths, like medieval bullet journals, but with more prayer and less colour coding. Some girdles were passed down for generations wrapped in cloth and tucked away in chests alongside wedding dresses and baby clothes. They carried the weight of memory and hope, and maybe a bit of superstition. And if they frayed too much, you didn't throw them out. You buried them properly, like a family member. You lean close as the caretaker lays the girdle across a small wooden altar. It smells faintly of old dust and lavender. A parchment tag hangs from one end, scrawled in fading ink for the comfort and rest of women. Some girdles were loaned from churches available to good Christian women for a small donation. You check it out like a library book, wear it for a week or a month, then return it hopefully not pregnant and ideally with a thank you prayer. One particularly famous girdle kept at Westminster Abbey was made of silk and embroidered with gold thread used by noblewomen, including queens. It wasn't just a relic. It was royal insurance. And yet peasant women made their own two simple belts from twisted flax, sometimes soaked in holy water, sometimes activated by touching the church altar or rubbing against a relic statue. In southern France, it was common to hang such a belt above the bedpost to keep the womb closed, like a do not disturb sign for fertility. Of course, the church itself sent mixed signals. While officially promoting children as divine gifts, it quietly tolerated these relics so long as they were used for protection and not for avoidance. Semantics did a lot of heavy lifting back then. You run your fingers over the cloth. The stitching is faint, but you catch one phrase, Sancta Margareta me custodiat. St. Margaret guard me. It's not subtle, but neither is childbirth. One curious fact, some girdles were shaped not just as belts, but as full body wraps, long strips that circled the chest, waist and hips, sometimes even the thighs. They were worn during the night of supposed conception, meant to tighten the body and confuse the flow of life. Think compression socks meets divine chastity. And while some women wore these relics discreetly under their clothes, others tied them around their pillows or hung them in doorways. There's even a record of a woman in Wales who tied one to a goose and released it, believing the wandering bird would carry her fertility into the hills. Fringe definitely. Effective. Let's just say the goose wasn't talking. The relics weren't always clean either. Passed from woman to woman, sometimes soaked with oils or wax drippings from vigil candles, these belts carried not just prayers, but the weight of shared desperation, and yet they offered something very real comfort, a sense of agency, a belief that you could take action, however small, against the overwhelming randomness of medieval reproduction. In a world with no reliable medicine, no scientific certainty, and no real choices, belief itself became a method. You watch as the caretaker carefully folds the girdle back into the chest. He doesn't ask your name. He doesn't have to. Every woman who visits carries the same story, even if she never speaks it aloud. The lock clicks shut, and the chapel's air seems a little lighter now. You leave quietly, the imagined feel of the relic belt still warm against your waist. Not a cure, not a guarantee, but a thread in a long line of hands just trying to hold the future still. The chapel behind you fades into shadow, and the path takes on a softer tone, moss beneath your boots, now the kind of trail that's not quite a road, not quite forgotten. Ahead, the trees lean in boughs, tangled heavy with summer's breath. You duck beneath a low-hanging branch and follow the sound of humming. Sweet, unhurried, familiar. You've wandered into a garden not for vegetables or herbs, but something stranger, a sanctuary for sympathetic magic. Yes, tonight you step into the quiet world of symbolic gestures, rituals and actions, performed not for their direct physical effects, but because they stood in for what a woman wanted to happen in her body. These were rituals of imitation, reflection, and metaphor. In other words, the medieval equivalent of manifesting fertility control. And believe it or not, they were everywhere. You approach the garden's centre. A woman stands beside a tree, carefully tying a bundle of herbs to one of its lower limbs. She mutters a phrase and tugs the knot tight. The bundle dangles like a message left for the wind. When she notices you, she smiles faintly and gestures to the many others, dozens tied to branches all around. This is a binding grove, a place where women tied symbolic objects to trees to bind the womb. Cloth for restraint, string for delay, bones for permanence, sometimes even dried fruit hollowed out to represent an empty womb. It's quiet, strange, and deeply personal. The theory. What you do outside the body with intention and care can influence what happens inside. It's not about science, it's about resonance. And in a world where little else is within your control, even a thread tied to a tree becomes an act of resistance. One mainstream historical fact, sympathetic magic, was a core part of medieval folk belief, based on the principle that like affects like. If you want to repel something, you mimic its departure. If you want to protect something, you wrap it, bind it, or cover it. The logic is dreamlike and yet surprisingly consistent. So here among the trees, women whispered their intentions to the leaves. Keep me empty, spare me this month, let the blood come soon. They didn't shout. This wasn't theatre. It was prayer dressed in metaphor. Historians still argue whether these acts were performed with genuine belief or more out of desperation. But the ritual of it, the preparation, the repetition, the secrecy suggests deep-rooted purpose. When you stand here among the bound branches, it feels less like superstition and more like a language. Some women buried stones beneath fruit trees symbolizing their buried fertility. Others placed iron nails in tree trunks to anchor their wombs shut, because iron was thought to have grounding protective powers. One particularly odd case from southern Germany involved a woman who poured goat's milk over a rock every day for a month, believing it would feed the stone instead of a baby. And then there were the dolls. Ah yes, the dolls. You step further into the garden and see them small crude figures made from straw or wax nestled among the roots of a willow tree. Some are swaddled tightly as if to say no entry. Others are pierced with thorns or wrapped in red thread. These were womb dolls. Not voodoo, not curses, just symbols crafted and used by women to speak to their bodies in the only language they had. One fringe account from 15th century Brittany describes a ritual where women would sew miniature linen pouches and carry them between their breasts. Inside a dry bean and a slip of paper with a Latin word sterilitas. These weren't curses. They were charms, talismans, intentions. You kneel beside one such doll, its head made from a twist of linen, its body just twine. It's wrapped in nettle leaves now dried and crackling. Someone made this with care. Someone believed in this enough to hide it, tend it, protect it from rain. One scholar once wrote that these acts were part theatre, part hope. But maybe that's just another way of saying they were human. Of course, the church had opinions, big ones. Symbolic magic, especially when performed without male oversight, was suspicious, heretical, dangerous. You might be seen as a witch for burying a red thread, or accused of demonic intent if you wore a bone pendant during Mass. And yet women persisted, not because they thought they were witches, but because their reality gave them no other options. The medical world had little help. The religious world demanded they accept every pregnancy as God's will. And the social world? Well, it was built on the assumption that you were a womb with legs. So you tied a thread to a tree, or you whispered to a wax doll, or you drew a spiral in the dirt and stood inside it while you said the same word 3 times, close, close, closed. In some places, entire groups of women performed these rituals together on nights when the moon was new and the air still. They gathered in circles, not for magic exactly, but for mutual agreement: we do not want another child. Not now, not this way. In the corner of this garden stands a small shrine barely taller than your hip. On it a stone dish holds burnt herbs and a coin, a kind of offering. Behind it, etched into the rock, is the image of a spiral. No inscription, just the shape. Womb shell closed gate. Pick your meaning. You press your hand against it and the stone is cool, smooth from years of touch. And suddenly it makes sense. The metaphors, the symbols, the gestures, they weren't silly. They were survival tools. In a world that gave you nothing, you built your own language of resistance out of sticks, thread and wax. You rise slowly. The woman who welcomed you here ties one last bundle to the branch and waves a hand, silent farewell. She's not smiling anymore, not exactly, but there's something peaceful in her face, like she's shared a secret and you've promised to keep it. You leave the garden quietly, not turning back. You don't want to break the spell. The garden fades behind you as you continue along a winding track that skirts a small river, its surface dappled with moonlight and the occasional flicker of a night insect. The air is cool, almost crisp, and the quiet water hums a gentle lullaby. You pause at a stone bridge leaning over the railing to watch the current slip past, whispering secrets you can almost catch. Here by the river's edge you find yourself drawn to the story of amniotic water and baths, a practice where medieval women turned to the soothing, sometimes strange power of water to influence fertility and childbirth. Water, after all, was sacred. It cleansed, it healed, it could bring life or wash it away. And for women wary of another pregnancy or desperate to avoid it, the rituals involving water were as varied as they were peculiar. You imagine a medieval woman drawing a wooden tub filled with river water, the coolness refreshing after a long day. Into this bath she adds herbs, maybe rue or pennyroyal, again infusing the water with scents and properties meant to calm the womb, or alternatively make it less welcoming to new life. One mainstream historical fact bathing for health was widespread in medieval Europe, though the Church's attitudes fluctuated. By the later Middle Ages, public baths had a reputation for moral danger, but private baths, especially with medicinal herbs, remained a trusted remedy. Women's baths, in particular, were often charged with mystical and practical significance. The water was thought to carry the essence of the herbs into the body, through the skin, softening contractions, easing pain, or in some cases preventing conception altogether. Some believed that bathing in water gathered at certain times, like the full moon or dawn, amplified these effects. Historians still argue whether these baths had any real contraceptive power, or if they functioned primarily as soothing rituals offering emotional relief in a world heavy with uncertainty. One curious ritual involved bathing in cold water after intercourse, sometimes combined with squeezing lemon juice or vinegar inside the vagina, an early if uncomfortable attempt at a natural contraceptive rinse. You shudder imagining how this must have felt. More unusual still were stories from rural England where women would take a bath in water, in which iron objects, nails, pins, even horseshoes had been soaked overnight. Iron was believed to have protective powers, and in this case the bath was thought to close the womb's gates. There's a fringe tale from a 14th century manuscript about a woman who bathed in water, mixed with ground snail shells and powdered bones, hoping the hardness of these substances would harden her womb against pregnancy. Whether she succeeded or not remains unknown, but it does sound like an early form of shell shock therapy. You imagine the sensation of slipping into such a bath, cool water swirling around your legs, the sharp scent of herbs filling the air, the sound of the river in the background like a distant heartbeat. Baths were also social events. Women gathered in groups to bathe, exchange stories and share remedies. These were private moments where knowledge passed hand to hand, where anxieties were soothed, and sometimes where intentions were set silently together. The Church's stance on these baths was complicated. On one hand, water was a symbol of purity and baptism. On the other, excessive concern with bodily matters, especially those related to fertility, could be labelled sinful. Some priests warned against magical baths, accusing women of attempting to manipulate God's will. Yet the demand for these remedies was so strong that many clerics turned a blind eye, recognizing that for many women, these rituals were the only control they had. One particularly fascinating aspect, midwives sometimes recommended baths after birth to help the uterus contract and shrink back to its pre-pregnancy state. But some also suggested bathing to prevent pregnancy altogether, a kind of post-coital detox. In Brittany, it was common for women to bathe in salt water mixed with herbs on the morning after sex, believing it would flush out any unwanted seed. Whether it did is anyone's guess, but it shows how ritual and medicine blended seamlessly. You step back from the river, the water's murmur fading as you climb the bank. Your clothes still feel damp from the air, and you wonder how many women over the centuries have stood here, hoping for a bath that could hold the power of life and death. As the moon shifts behind a cloud, you realize that these baths were more than just about the body. They were acts of hope, quiet rebellions against fate, and in their way they were as essential as any charm or potion. You keep walking the river to your left, the soft crunch of your footsteps mixing with the distant call of a night bird. The night is deepening now, but the stories are far from over. The river's murmur recedes behind you, replaced by the soft rustle of leaves and the distant lowing of cattle settling in for the night. You find yourself walking toward a village cluster, its rough timber houses and thatched roofs huddled like secrets against the dark. Here among these familiar shapes lies another quiet way women approach the impossible task of controlling childbirth, the power of language and silence. Words are weapons, spells and prayers all at once in the medieval world, and sometimes what you don't say could be just as powerful as what you whispered in the shadows. You enter the dimly lit hearth of a midwife's home, the scent of wood smoke thick in the air. A group of women sit cross-legged near the fire, their faces flickering in the low glow. They speak softly, not of herbs or baths now, but of the delicate art of speech, silence, and secrecy. One of them recounts a tale of the silent charm a spell cast not by spoken words but by intentional quiet. A woman would sit in the room where conception was expected to happen, and simply remain silent, her silence itself, a boundary, a kind of invisible barrier preventing the act from completing its usual work. It's a practice rooted in the belief that the body listens to the mind and the soul. By controlling what was spoken and what was left unspoken, women could influence their own fates. This echoes a mainstream historical fact in many medieval societies. Speech and silence were deeply gendered. Women were often expected to be silent and obedient, but they found ways to wield silence as a form of power. Scholars call this the politics of quiet, but this power extended beyond mere silence. There were secret words, whispered prayers, and coded phrases passed between women, sometimes in Latin, sometimes in local dialects, meant to obscure intentions from men, priests, or nosy neighbours. One fringe tidbit is the use of mumbling charms. These were low, half-prayed, half-sung phrases, barely audible, repeated under breath, often while performing another task like sewing or churning butter. Historians still argue whether these were genuine charms or just comforting mumbling, but their ubiquity suggests they mattered. In parts of England and France, midwives would instruct women to recite specific biblical verses backward, or to count certain numbers silently during intercourse or after as a kind of numerical shield. The idea was that by confusing the usual flow of language or numbers, the process of conception could be interrupted or redirected. You listen as an elder midwife demonstrates a whispered phrase she learned from her grandmother. It's a string of Latin words that sound like nonsense to your ears, but the woman says it's a shut door spell, a linguistic lock for the womb. The room grows quieter still, and you feel the weight of generations carried in these words. Another curious practice involved the use of curse tablets, small inscribed pieces of lead or wax buried under thresholds or in walls. While mostly associated with cursing enemies, some tablets included pleas to prevent pregnancy, often inscribed secretly, and buried by women fearful of unwanted conception. The Church condemned these tablets, but their persistence suggests a hidden history of women's resistance. In some regions, silence was literal. Women were told to avoid speaking on certain days of the menstrual cycle, or during key times after intercourse, believing words could open the womb or call the seed home. The balance between speaking and silence was like walking a tightrope, and there's a subtle humour here too. One medieval poem jokingly warns men to watch their tongues lest a careless word undo all their efforts. You realise that for many women, language was a secret battlefield where prayers, curses, and silence intertwined. It wasn't just about avoiding pregnancy. It was about carving out a little space of control in a world that tried to dictate their bodies and futures. The night outside the midwife's hut is deepening, but inside the flickering fire feels warm and alive. The power of whispered words and sacred silences is as tangible as any herb or relic. You step back into the night, the voices fading softly behind you. And as you walk on, you carry a new understanding. Sometimes the quietest resistance is the most profound. The midwife's fire flickers behind you, its glow retreating into the cool night, as you make your way down a narrow lane lined with half-timbered houses and winding stone walls. Your footsteps echo softly against the cobblestones, and the faint smell of baked bread lingers in the air, mingling with the distant bleats of sheep settling into their pens. The village has gone quiet, but your journey presses on toward a less visible, more tactile world, one made of touch pressure and the mysterious art of body manipulation. You pause by a small, weather-worn sign hanging above a doorway the bonesetter's house. The door creaks open, revealing a dim room filled with the scent of linseed oil, dried herbs, and something faintly metallic. Inside, an older woman with rough hands and a steady gaze beckons you in. Here you discover the practice of external womb manipulation, a method midwives and healers sometimes use to influence fertility menstrual flow, or even prevent pregnancy by physically interacting with the body. You watch as she demonstrates gentle pressure points and massage techniques, her hands moving slowly over a lifelike model of the lower abdomen. A mainstream historical fact, midwives in medieval Europe often used manual manipulation massages and herbal compresses to assist childbirth or regulate the menstrual cycle. These techniques were passed down orally and varied widely by region, but the fringe practices are particularly fascinating. Some midwives believed that by applying pressure to specific points, just below the navel, near the hips, or along the inner thighs, they could close the womb, slow the flow of menstrual blood, or encourage a miscarriage. There's even a curious historical record from the 15th century describing a technique called womb binding, where tight bands or cloths were wrapped around the lower belly for days or weeks at a time with the aim of restricting blood flow and preventing conception. Historians still argue whether such methods had any physiological effect or were mainly psychological and symbolic. But in a time without reliable contraception, even a placebo could mean the difference between hope and despair. You notice the bone setter's hands moving deliberately, pressing along the pelvic area, kneading muscle and tendon with slow rhythmic motions. She explains that women sometimes combined these manipulations with herbal salves like a potion and a massage in one. One particularly odd belief involved the use of womb stones, small smooth pebbles kept warm and pressed against the belly to encourage or discourage fertility depending on how and when they were applied. Some women carried these stones in pouches close to the skin, believing the warmth and texture could influence the womb's mood. You try to imagine the sensation warm stone against cold skin, the rhythmic pressure like a silent conversation between the body and the mind. In some communities, midwives advised women to avoid certain postures or physical activities that might open the womb at inopportune times. Sitting with legs crossed tightly, wearing tight belts, or avoiding certain types of dance were all thought to help regulate fertility. The bone setter stories include a more peculiar practice from Ireland, where women would use a carved wooden wedge inserted carefully to block conception, a primitive and no doubt uncomfortable form of barrier contraception. Despite the Church's growing suspicion of midwives and their manual methods, many healers retained a kind of unofficial respect, especially in rural areas where priests rarely ventured. The physical nature of these techniques made them hard to regulate or dismiss outright. And beyond the practical, there was an intimate bond between midwife and woman, a trust built on touch and knowledge passed through generations. You leave the bone setter's house with a sense of awe for the skill involved and a quiet respect for the desperation that drove women to seek control in whatever way they could. The night is growing colder, but the memory of those steady hands lingers a reminder that sometimes resistance is felt as much as seen or spoken. As you step outside, the village is silent again, but the stories of hands and touch, pressure and warmth hum beneath the surface like a quiet heartbeat waiting to be heard. You leave the bone setter's house behind and follow a narrow dirt road that climbs gradually through a patchwork of fields and meadows. The scent of wildflowers and fresh earth fills the cool night air, and overhead stars begin to twinkle faintly like scattered whispers from another time. As you walk, your thoughts settle on the body's inner world, its secret cycles, rhythms and hidden signs. You arrive at a small stone chapel, where an unusual kind of medieval medical knowledge quietly flourished the reading of bodily signs and omens. For centuries, women, and often the healers around them, believed that the body's subtle messages could reveal not only health, but fertility status, the likelihood of conception, or the timing to avoid or invite pregnancy. This was an art of careful observation, almost like reading a secret language written beneath the skin. A well-known historical fact is that medieval medicine frequently relied on humoral theory, the idea that health depended on balancing four bodily fluids: blood phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. This belief shaped treatments and interpretations of symptoms, including those related to fertility and pregnancy. But within this framework, women developed an acute sense of self-awareness, tracking the flow of their menstrual cycles, noting changes in discharge mood or appetite, and interpreting dreams as omens of fertility or barrenness. One fringe tidbit involves the use of womb omen signs in the body or environment that were believed to indicate pregnancy or fertility potential. For example, some women believed that a persistent metallic taste in the mouth or an unusual craving for sour foods could mean a pregnancy was imminent or had been avoided. Historians still argue whether these bodily readings were reliable or simply coincidental, but they undoubtedly shaped women's decisions and hopes. You imagine a woman in the village carefully observing her body in a small dimly lit room, counting the days since her last period, feeling for changes in the abdomen, noting the texture of her skin or the colour of her urine, each detail a clue in a silent puzzle. In some cases, women kept menstrual diaries, not the diaries you might imagine, but collections of marks and symbols scratched into wood or parchment tracking cycles with astonishing accuracy. Another curious practice was the interpretation of dreams. If a woman dreamed of certain animals like snakes or birds or specific actions, she might believe the dream foretold her fertility fate. One medieval medical text suggested that dreaming of red wine meant fertility, while dreaming of ashes signalled barrenness. You pause at the chapel's door, touching the cool stone. Inside, a group of women once gathered to share these signs and omens, pooling their knowledge like a quiet library of hidden wisdom. One particularly strange but fascinating detail involves the belief that the shape of the belly early in pregnancy could predict the sex of the baby, or the likelihood of miscarriage. Some midwives claim they could read the womb shape with their hands, a practice blending anatomy with intuition. And then there's the curious case of the belly button omen. Women believed that if their navel changed shape, becoming more prominent or deepening, it signaled pregnancy or even impending labour. This might sound bizarre now, but in a time without ultrasounds or pregnancy tests, every detail counted. You step back from the chapel and look up at the stars, realizing how profoundly connected these women were to the rhythms of their bodies and the natural world. Their knowledge wasn't just superstition, it was a form of empowerment, a way to understand and sometimes subtly influence the forces that govern their lives. The night wraps around you like a soft blanket as you continue your journey, carrying with you the quiet wisdom of bodily signs and omens, ancient messages still whispered beneath the surface of our modern understanding. You leave the chapel's cool shadows behind, stepping onto a forest path carpeted with pine needles and dappled moonlight. The scent of resin and earth rises as you walk, the only sounds the distant hoot of an owl and the soft crunch of your boots. Your thoughts turn now to another method darker and more mysterious, nestled deep within the secret world of medieval women's knowledge, the use of poisons and abortifacients. You tread carefully here, for this is a territory tangled with danger, secrecy and controversy. Medieval women, often desperate to avoid pregnancy, sometimes turn to plants and substances known for their harsh effects on the womb, herbs that could induce miscarriage or prevent implantation. A mainstream historical fact, the use of herbal abortifacients is well documented throughout history, and medieval Europe was no exception. Midwives and women's healers collected knowledge on plants like hemlock pennyroyal and rue, which could be toxic in high doses but were believed to have contraceptive or abortive properties. The use of such substances was unsurprisingly taboo, and often condemned by the church and legal authorities. Accusations of poisoning or witchcraft could arise from their use, making this practice a dangerous gamble for many women. But there are fringe, less discussed accounts suggesting that knowledge of these plants and their effects was surprisingly widespread among women of different classes. Some manuscripts list recipes for potions combining multiple ingredients carefully dosed to avoid killing the mother while ending an unwanted pregnancy. Historians still argue whether these methods were effective or primarily driven by fear and anecdote, as the line between medicine and poison was perilously thin. You imagine a woman gathering these herbs in the quiet of a moonlit garden, fingers brushing over dusty leaves and bitter roots, each plant carrying the weight of both hope and peril. One of the more unsettling stories involves the use of pennyroyal tea, which, while popular for easing menstrual cramps, was also used in larger doses to induce abortion. The downside was its toxicity, which sometimes caused severe illness or death. This risk didn't deter many desperate women, though, highlighting the limited options available. Another curious practice involved the application of external poultices made from toxic plants, placed directly over the lower abdomen. The belief was that these would push away an unwanted fetus without the need for ingestion. The efficacy and safety of this remain debated, but the practice underscores how women sought indirect, less detectable means. The fear of punishment meant this knowledge was often passed quietly between mother and daughter midwife, and apprentice in hushed tones and coded language. In some regions, herbal abortifacients were referred to as women's secrets, or the remedy of silence. You recall a chilling story from a 15th century court case, where a woman was accused of poisoning her husband, but the testimony hinted that the real crime was her use of herbs to end a pregnancy. The line between self-care and crime was perilously thin. And then there's the shadowy world of alchemical abortifacients, rare recipes blending herbs with metals or minerals inspired by early chemical experimentation. These concoctions were experimental and highly risky, but they reveal the lengths women might have gone to reclaim control. You pause beneath an ancient oak tree, feeling the weight of all this hidden knowledge pressing down like its heavy branches. The use of poisons and abortifacients was a desperate, dangerous path one travelled in silence and fear, but also in fierce determination. As you continue down the forest path, the night air sharp and cool, you realise that medieval women's methods to avoid childbirth weren't just medical. They were acts of courage, rebellion, and survival. The forest swallows your footsteps, but the stories linger like whispered warnings and silent prayers carried on the wind. The forest's shadows stretch long and deep as you leave the oak behind, stepping into a clearing. where the first hints of dawn soften the night sky. The air holds a fragile stillness, and the faint scent of damp earth rises with the morning mist. Your journey now takes you to a quieter, more spiritual domain, the role of prayer saints, and sacred relics in women's hopes to control fertility and childbirth. Medieval Europe was steeped in religious faith, and women turned often to the divine when faced with the uncertainties of pregnancy. You imagine kneeling in a small chapel, the flicker of candlelight illuminating faded frescoes of saints who had become patrons of childbirth and fertility. A well-established historical fact is that women frequently sought the intercession of saints like St. Margaret of Antioch, St. Anne, and the Virgin Mary figures believed to offer protection during pregnancy, safe delivery, or in some cases aid in avoiding pregnancy altogether. But this religious devotion was far from simple supplication. It involved complex rituals, pilgrimages, and the use of sacred objects believed to hold miraculous power. One particularly fascinating practice involved touching or carrying relics, small fragments of bone, cloth, or objects associated with saints. Women believed that carrying these relics close to the body, sometimes sewn into clothing, or hidden in pouches, could influence fertility, or protect against unwanted conception. Historians still debate whether relics were genuinely believed to have magical power, or whether their effectiveness was primarily psychological, providing comfort in a world rife with uncertainty. One curious detail comes from the shrine of St. Anne in Germany, where women seeking to avoid childbirth would tie ribbons inscribed with prayers to a tree near the church, hoping the saint's blessing would grant them relief. Pilgrimages were another key aspect. Women sometimes travelled great distances, enduring hardship and pain, to visit shrines reputed for fertility miracles. The journey itself was an act of devotion, sacrifice, and perhaps a desperate hope. A fringe practice involved the use of prayer rolls, long strips of parchment, inscribed with prayers and holy images, which women would wrap around their abdomen or keep beneath their pillow. These were personalized charms, blending faith and folk medicine. In some cases, women took part in communal prayers or fasts designed specifically to influence fertility. These acts blurred the lines between spiritual and physical intervention, creating a holistic approach to childbirth's dangers. You imagine the tactile sensation of these relics, the rough texture of aged cloth, the cold hardness of a bone fragment pressed against the skin, and the profound sense of trust placed in these objects. Yet the Church's stance was complicated. While saints' intercession was encouraged, the use of relics to actively prevent pregnancy sometimes raised eyebrows among clergy who worried about superstition overshadowing doctrine. There are accounts of midwives blending prayer with herbal remedies, weaving spiritual and medical knowledge into a seamless practice that honoured both God and nature. As dawn brightens, you step out of the chapel and feel the warmth of morning light on your face. The intertwining of faith, hope, and medicine reveals a world where women sought control through every means available, tangible and intangible alike. The air is calm now, and the stories of saints and sacred relics echo softly in the quiet, reminding you that in the medieval world even prayer was a form of quiet resistance. The morning light spills over rolling hills as you leave the chapel behind the world, waking up around you with bird song and the rustle of leaves in a gentle breeze. You find yourself wandering toward the bustling market square of a nearby town, where scents of fresh bread and spiced wine mingle with the chatter of vendors and townsfolk. Here in the crossroads of commerce and daily life lies another hidden chapter. In the story, the trade and secret exchange of contraceptives and remedies. You weave through the crowd, careful not to draw attention as you overhear whispers of small bottles, dried herbs and curious powders traded discreetly between women. This bustling marketplace wasn't just a place for buying food or tools, it was also a quiet hub for the clandestine circulation of birth control knowledge. A well-documented historical fact is that medieval apothecaries and herbalists sold various remedies for menstrual regulation and fertility control, some openly, many others in coded or euphemistic language. But what you discover here goes beyond official shops. Women often relied on a network of trusted midwives, healers, and even other women to obtain secret mixtures, ointments, pills made from ground herbs or potions brewed to prevent conception or induce miscarriage. Historians still argue how widespread and effective these exchanges were given the risks involved in using unregulated substances and the penalties women faced if caught. One fringe tidbit involves the use of love filters mixtures reputed to affect desire, fertility, or conception. Some were harmless potions of rosewater and honey, but others contained potent herbs like silphium, a now extinct plant once famous for its contraceptive properties, or various bitter roots. The trade wasn't limited to physical goods. You imagine women sharing recipes and advice in hushed conversations, exchanging whispered secrets under the cover of night far from the prying eyes of husbands, priests, or inquisitors. In some towns, women used secret symbols, simple marks etched onto doorposts or painted on small stones, to signal the presence of trusted midwives or herbalists offering these remedies. This silent language of trust and secrecy formed a vital lifeline. You spot an old woman near a stall discreetly handing a small leather pouch to a younger woman, the exchange swift and cautious. The pouch contains dried rue and pennyroyal known contraceptives, of the time wrapped carefully in a linen cloth. A curious story comes from southern France, where women reportedly smuggled contraceptive seeds hidden in clothing, passing them along a network stretching between villages. The marketplace with its vibrant energy masks this delicate undercurrent of rebellion and necessity. Here, amid the calls of vendors and laughter of children, women carved out spaces to control their bodies and futures. The church and local authorities often cracked down on these trades, labeling them sinful or dangerous. Midwives could be accused of witchcraft, and women found with abortive herbs risked punishment or social exile. Yet despite the risks, this hidden commerce persisted, fueled by a desperate need and a collective will to survive. As you leave the market, behind the scent of herbs and spices lingers a fragrant reminder of the quiet battles waged in everyday exchanges. The town wakes fully now, but beneath the bustle, the silent trade continues, an invisible thread connecting women through time, space, and shared experience. You step away from the lively market square, the hum of voices fading behind you, as you wander toward the edge of a dense forest, where shadows deepen beneath the towering oaks and birches. The forest floor is soft beneath your feet, muffling your steps, and a faint breeze carries the scent of moss and damp leaves. Here, hidden from the watchful eyes of townsfolk and clergy alike, lies a more mystical and secretive approach to avoiding childbirth, the use of charms, amulets, and folk magic. You imagine a woman sitting quietly by a tree root, weaving together herbs, feathers, and small bones into a talisman meant to shield her womb from conception. In medieval Europe, folk magic and superstition blended seamlessly with practical remedies, creating a tapestry of beliefs and rituals designed to protect, to harm, or to influence fate. A mainstream historical fact is that charms and amulets were widely used throughout medieval Europe, not only for fertility but for health protection against evil spirits and general luck. Women often wore these objects close to their bodies, believing in their power to alter unseen forces, but the fringe aspects of this practice are especially intriguing. Some charms involved inscribed prayers or magical symbols written in Latin or local dialects, designed specifically to ward off pregnancy or miscarriage. These objects might be hidden in the folds of a woman's dress or buried under the threshold of her home. Historians still argue to what extent these charms influenced actual fertility outcomes, or whether their power was purely psychological, rooted in faith and cultural tradition. One curious example involves womb dolls, small figurines carved from wood or bone, sometimes wrapped in cloth and hidden beneath pillows or beds. Women believed these dolls could absorb unwanted pregnancies or redirect fertility elsewhere. You learn of a peculiar charm from the British Isles, a tiny pouch containing a mixture of herbs, spiderwebs, and fairy dust, a mixture of powdered quartz and mica thought to confuse the womb and prevent conception by bewildering the body's natural rhythms. Another practice involved the binding of fertility through knots tied in special cords or ribbons. Each knot represented a desired effect, blocking pregnancy or encouraging menstruation, and the cords were kept close, sometimes carried on the person or hidden in the home. You notice how these charms often incorporated elements of local folklore, blending Christian symbols with ancient pagan traditions. For example, crosses might be combined with runes or protective inscriptions drawn from older belief systems, creating a syncretic magic uniquely suited to women's needs. The use of folk magic was not without risk, however. Clergy condemned these practices as heretical or superstitious, and accusations of witchcraft could lead to severe punishment. Still, women persisted, often practicing in secret, their knowledge handed down through whispered stories and hidden books. In one small village you find a tale of a woman who used a charm made from a silver coin and a sprig of vervain buried beneath the hearth, which she believed protected her from unwanted pregnancies for years. The boundary between medicine, magic, and religion here is blurred, illustrating how medieval women navigated a complex world to assert some control over their bodies. As you step back from the forest's edge, the morning sun breaks through the trees, casting warm golden light across the ground. You carry with you the image of charms and amulets, silent tactile objects charged with hope, fear, and determination. The quiet magic of these relics reminds you that sometimes the power to change fate lies in the smallest, most hidden things. You emerge from the forest as the day fully unfolds, the sun casting a warm glow over fields ripe with wildflowers and the gentle hum of bees working their invisible magic. The air feels lighter now, as if the weight of countless stories is lifted, leaving behind only a quiet understanding. Your final step on this long journey leads you to a small village green where life continues quietly shaped by the ancient wisdom and struggles of women across centuries. Here the story of social and legal repercussions comes into sharp focus, the reality behind the hidden efforts to avoid childbirth. Throughout medieval Europe, the desire to control fertility was often met with suspicion, fear, and harsh consequences. Women who sought to prevent pregnancy, whether through herbs, charms, prayers, or physical methods, risked not only social ostracism, but legal punishment. You can almost hear the whispers in dark corners, the fear of betrayal, the heavy weight of silence. A well-documented historical fact is that laws against abortion and infanticide existed across many medieval kingdoms, though enforcement varied widely. Midwives and women could face fines, imprisonment, or worse, depending on local customs and the zeal of authorities. But beyond the legal texts lies a more complex social web. Women's attempts to avoid childbirth were often framed as moral failings, or even witchcraft, with accusations serving as tools of control in patriarchal societies. However, historians still argue how uniformly these laws were applied, and whether many cases were dismissed or handled quietly to avoid scandal. You imagine a woman in a village square nervously clutching a bundle of herbs, aware that a neighbour's accusation could mean ruin. The fear of exposure kept many practices underground, forcing women into secrecy and isolation. One particularly poignant story involves a midwife in 14th century England, accused of poisoning a noblewoman after administering a herbal abortifacient. The trial records reveal the midwife's desperate attempts to protect her client and herself, underscoring the precarious balance between care and criminality. You also learn that some communities had unofficial codes where midwives were protected by local customs, recognized as essential and trusted even as the church condemned their methods. The social stigma extended to women who suffered miscarriages, often blamed for their own misfortune or accused of wrongdoing. This harsh judgment created a culture of silence and fear around fertility and childbirth. At the same time, folk beliefs sometimes shielded women, portraying certain failures of pregnancy as the work of malevolent spirits or curses rather than personal fault. These beliefs offered a different kind of protection, social and emotional, amid harsh realities. You picture a circle of women gathered secretly in a warm kitchen, sharing stories, remedies, and support their bonds, a quiet rebellion against a harsh world. As the day winds down, you feel the pulse of history, its compassion. Cruelty and complexity settle softly over the village green. The legacy of medieval women's struggles to avoid childbirth is woven into the fabric of human experience, a testament to resilience and the enduring quest for autonomy. You take a deep breath, feeling the sun's warmth on your face, and the gentle rhythm of life continuing around you, carrying forward the quiet strength of countless women who came before. The sun dips slowly toward the horizon, casting long, soft shadows that stretch across the quiet village green where your journey began. The world seems to breathe a little slower now, the frenetic whispers of the past fading into a gentle hush. You feel a calm settling in, as if the weight of countless stories, the hopes, fears, and quiet rebellions of medieval women has been gently placed beside you, safe and still. In this fading light, the strange and often silent ways these women sought to avoid childbirth become less a tale of hardship and more a testament to resilience. They lived in a world without modern medicine, without the comforts or freedoms we take for granted. Yet they found ways to listen to their bodies, to read the signs, to harness the power of nature, prayer, and community. They navigated danger with courage, weaving knowledge and faith into invisible shields against a future they might not be ready to face. Now, as you settle into the softness of the evening, remember that these stories are not just relics of the past, but echoes that ripple quietly through time, reminders of strength, of quiet resistance, and of the unyielding human spirit. Feel your breath deepen, the pulse of the world slowing to match your own. Let the cool night air carry away any lingering tension, and allow yourself to drift gently, wrapped in the warmth of understanding and compassion. Sleep now comes easily, softly, like a whispered lullaby from ages gone by. Rest well, knowing you have travelled through history's hush, where even the quietest voices hold profound truths. Good night and sweet dreams.